Marcus Thompson had never imagined that a hole filled with water could become his personal hell. But as he stood on his back patio at 6:47 a.m., coffee mug trembling slightly in his grip, he stared at what could only be described as a green, bubbling monument to his poor life choices. The swimming pool that had once been the crown jewel of 42 Maple Street now resembled something from a horror movie. A writhing mass of algae so thick it looked like someone had dumped several buckets of green paint into what was supposed to be crystal clear water. "This ends today," Marcus muttered, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of frustration, failed chemical treatments, and repair bills that had collectively cost more than his car. The pool had seemed like such a dream when he first toured the house. Sarah, his realtor, had practically glowed as she gestured toward the kidney-shaped oasis nestled between mature oak trees. "Imagine the summer parties," she gushed. "The property value alone makes this a steal." What she hadn't mentioned, what no one had bothered to tell him, was that the previous owners had been locked in a 2-year battle with the city's health department over chronic maintenance violations, or that the filtration system was held together with duct tape and prayers. The first summer had been manageable. Marcus had thrown himself into pool ownership with the enthusiasm of a man determined to justify a massive financial decision. He bought every chemical known to man, installed a robotic cleaner he'd nicknamed Bruce, and even splurged on those floating LED lights that made the water glow like something from a resort commercial. For exactly 6 weeks, it had been perfect. Then came the algae bloom that no amount of shock treatment could eliminate. The filtration pump died in the middle of July's heat wave, turning the pool into a fetid swamp that attracted every mosquito within a 5-mile radius. The repair estimate had made Marcus seriously consider whether his kidney was worth more on the black market than his pool was worth to maintain. But Marcus was nothing if not stubborn. He doubled down, calling in specialists, upgrading equipment, and spending his weekends hunched over the water with test strips like some sort of suburban chemist. The pool would clear up for a few weeks, just long enough for him to convince himself he'd solved the problem, then crash spectacularly. Last month, the health department had actually posted a violation notice on his front door after a neighbor complained about the smell. That neighbor, he knew without looking, was probably watching him right now from her kitchen window. Karen Wellington lived in the pristine colonial next door, and from the moment Marcus had moved in, she'd appointed herself the unofficial quality control manager for the entire neighborhood. Her own backyard was a testament to obsessive-compulsive gardening, every blade of grass precisely trimmed, every flower bed edged with military precision, every garden ornament positioned with the care of a museum curator. She made it abundantly clear, through a series of increasingly passive-aggressive conversations over the fence, that Marcus's pool situation was not just an eyesore, but a personal affront to everything she held dear about suburban living. "Good morning, Marcus." Her voice carried across the yard with that particular blend of false cheer and barely concealed judgment that had become as familiar as his morning alarm. "I see you're up early today. Are we finally going to do something about that situation?" Marcus closed his eyes and counted to 5. In the 3 years since he'd moved to Maple Street, Karen had managed to insert herself into virtually every aspect of his property management decisions. She complained about his grass height, his mailbox placement, and the color he'd chosen for his front door. The pool, however, had become her magnum opus of neighborhood interference. "Morning, Karen," he called back, not bothering to turn around. He could see her reflection in the sliding glass door, a woman in her 50s with the kind of precisely styled hair that required weekly salon appointments, and the posture of someone perpetually prepared to speak to a manager. "You know," Karen continued, apparently taking his acknowledgement as an invitation for conversation, "I was talking to Brenda from the HOA yesterday, and she mentioned that there are very specific guidelines about maintaining water features. I'd hate for you to run into any complications." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Karen had been lobbying the Homeowners Association for months, trying to find some regulation she could use to force Marcus into action. So far, she'd been unsuccessful. The HOA's rules were surprisingly sparse when it came to pool maintenance. But Marcus knew she hadn't given up. "Actually, Karen," Marcus said, finally turning to face his neighbor with a smile that probably looked more menacing than friendly. "I'm glad you brought that up. I've made a decision." Karen's eyebrows shot up with the eager anticipation of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Oh, are you finally going to hire a proper pool service? I have a friend who knows someone. Whoa. I'm filling it in." The words hung in the air between them like a dropped bomb. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, making her look remarkably like the fish that had somehow ended up living in Marcus's pool despite the toxic conditions. "You're what?" she finally managed. "Filling it in," Marcus repeated, enjoying the moment more than he probably should have. "The whole thing. Dirt, topsoil, maybe some nice landscaping. I'm thinking a vegetable garden, maybe some fruit trees." Karen's face went through a remarkable spectrum of colors, starting with confusion, progressing through shock, and landing somewhere in the vicinity of apoplexy. "You can't just fill in a pool. That's destroying property value. That's destroying the entire character of the neighborhood." "It's my property, Karen." "But the permits, the inspections." Karen sputtered, grasping for some regulation, some rule, some authority she could invoke to stop this madness. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a screenshot of the city permit application he'd submitted 3 days ago, already filed. Should be approved by the end of the week. The look of horror on Karen's face was worth every penny he was about to spend on fill dirt. She stood there, mouth agape, clutching her pruning shears like they might somehow help her combat this unprecedented assault on her vision of suburban perfection. "This isn't over," she said finally, her voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone usually reserved for teenagers who walked on her grass. Marcus raised his coffee mug in a mock toast. "Looking forward to it, neighbor." As Karen stalked back toward her house, Marcus turned to look at his pool one last time before the transformation began. Soon, this green nightmare would be nothing but a memory, replaced by something that actually brought him joy instead of monthly financial hemorrhaging. He had no idea that his simple desire for a peaceful backyard was about to turn into the most entertaining neighborhood drama Maple Street had seen in decades. Little did Marcus know, Karen Wellington had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. As she disappeared through her back door, she was already mentally composing the first of what would become a legendary series of complaints, petitions, and ultimately, the phone call that would make her the laughingstock of the entire subdivision. The war for 42 Maple Street was about to begin. Marcus had always considered himself a reasonably intelligent man, but nothing had prepared him for the labyrinthine nightmare that was municipal bureaucracy. Standing in the lobby of City Hall at 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, clutching a manila folder stuffed with forms he printed at 2 a.m. the night before, he felt like a gladiator entering the arena. Except instead of lions, he was about to face something far more terrifying. Government employees who hadn't had their coffee yet. The permit office was a fluorescent-lit purgatory that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and broken dreams. Behind bulletproof glass that seemed excessive for a building department, 3 clerks moved with the urgency of sedated sloths, each one apparently engaged in a competition to see who could make the simplest task take the longest amount of time. "Next," called a woman whose name tag read Dolores, and whose expression suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. Marcus approached the window with the cautious optimism of someone who'd already filled out 17 different forms online, only to be told he needed to bring physical copies of forms that weren't available for download. "I need to apply for a permit to fill in my swimming pool," Marcus said, sliding his folder through the small opening beneath the glass. Dolores looked at him like he'd just announced his intention to launch himself to Mars using a giant slingshot. "Fill in a pool," she repeated, as if the concept was so foreign it required translation. "Yes, I want to remove my swimming pool and fill the area with dirt and landscaping." Dolores stared at him for a long moment, then turned to her colleague, a man whose desk nameplate proclaimed him to be Jerome, Senior Permit Specialist. "Jerome," she called across the office. "This guy wants to fill in his pool." The entire permit office went quiet. Even the ancient copy machine in the corner seemed to pause its mechanical wheezing. Jerome looked up from whatever he'd been pretending to work on and adjusted his glasses with the slow deliberation of a man who just witnessed something unprecedented. "Fill it in?" Jerome asked, standing up and walking over with the measured gait of a detective approaching a crime scene. "Like permanently?" "That's generally what fill in means," Marcus replied, immediately regretting the sarcasm when both Jerome and Dolores fixed him with identical stares of bureaucratic disapproval. "Sir," Jerome said, his voice taking on the patient tone usually reserved for small children and the mentally impaired, "swimming pools are considered permanent structures that add significant value to residential properties. Are you sure you understand what you're asking to do?" Marcus felt his jaw clench. "I'm asking to do something with my own property that will improve my quality of life and eliminate a health hazard that your own health department has cited me for." Jerome and Dolores exchanged a look that somehow conveyed volumes about their shared opinion of homeowners who thought they knew better than city officials. "Well," Dolores said, pulling out a different set of forms, "you'll need to fill out a property modification request, a structural alteration permit, and a landscaping change notice. You'll also need a survey of the property lines, a soil composition analysis, and approval from the Public Works Department regarding drainage impact." Marcus stared at the growing pile of paperwork. To fill a hole with dirt? To fill a permitted water feature with non-engineered fill material that could potentially impact neighborhood drainage patterns and property values. Jerome corrected, clearly enjoying himself now. By the time Marcus left City Hall 2 hours later, he had 14 different forms, appointments with 3 separate departments, and a profound understanding of why some people snapped and moved to cabins in the woods where the only permit required was the one issued by common sense. Meanwhile, back on Maple Street, Karen Wellington was conducting what could only be described as a surveillance operation. She positioned herself at her kitchen sink, ostensibly washing dishes that had been clean for the past hour, but actually monitoring Marcus's house with the intensity of a Cold War spy. When she saw his car pull into the driveway, she immediately abandoned her fake dishwashing and speed walked to her front yard, where she began the most aggressive flower deadheading in suburban history. "How did it go at City Hall?" she called out, not even pretending she hadn't been watching for his return. Marcus paused at his mailbox, his arms full of permits and forms. "Just peachy, Karen, thanks for asking." "You know," Karen said, snipping a perfectly healthy rosebud with unnecessary force, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, and I really think you're making a mistake." "Duly noted." "I mean, removing a pool, that's such a permanent decision, and the impact on property values." She shook her head sadly, as if Marcus had just announced his intention to open a toxic waste dump in his backyard. Marcus turned to face her fully, his patience finally wearing thin. "Karen, with all due respect, my property values are my concern, not yours. But we're neighbors." Karen protested, her voice rising to the pitch she usually reserved for teenagers who walked on her grass. "What affects one property affects us all. That's just basic real estate economics." "You know what else affects property values?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Having a neighbor who calls the health department every time someone's grass gets half an inch too long." Karen's face flushed red. "I have never." "You called them about my dandelions, Karen." "Dandelions? Those weren't just dandelions, they were weeds that exist in literally every yard in this neighborhood except yours, because you probably have them professionally executed." Before Karen could formulate a response, Marcus's other neighbor, Dave Chen, emerged from his house with a bag of garbage. Dave was a software engineer who worked from home and had therefore witnessed more of Karen's antics than anyone should be legally required to endure. "Hey, Marcus," Dave called out. "I heard you're finally doing something about the swamp. Good for you, man." "Thanks, Dave. Just waiting for the permits to go through." "Permits?" Karen's voice cracked slightly. "What permits?" Marcus held up his folder of paperwork. "All the permits, Karen. Every single one the city could think of, plus a few I'm pretty sure they invented just for me." Dave grinned. "That's city government for you. Takes an act of Congress to change a light bulb, but somehow they can approve a strip mall in a residential zone overnight." This is exactly what I'm talking about, Karen interjected, apparently interpreting Dave's comment as support for her position. If Marcus needs all these permits, clearly this isn't something that should be done lightly. Actually, Dave said, his programmer's logic kicking in, it sounds like the city is just covering their bureaucratic butts. Marcus has every right to modify his own property, especially if it's causing health issues. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to catch flies. The concept that someone might actually support Marcus's decision seemed to short-circuit her entire worldview. But the neighborhood character, she sputtered. Karen, Dave said with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. Half the houses on this street have been renovated beyond recognition in the past 5 years. The Johnsons added a second story, the Patels put in that huge deck, and don't even get me started on what the Hendersons did to their front yard. But somehow, Marcus wanting to plant some vegetables is going to destroy the neighborhood character. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward Dave, who just articulated everything he'd been thinking but hadn't been able to express without sounding petty. That's completely different, Karen protested, though she seemed to be struggling to explain exactly how. Different how? Dave pressed. Because those were improvements, enhancements. This is destruction. Destroying a health hazard that breeds mosquitoes and violates city codes, Marcus pointed out. Creating beautiful landscaping that will actually add value to the neighborhood, Dave added. Karen stood there, pruning shears clutched in her hands like a weapon, looking increasingly desperate as her arguments crumbled around her. This isn't over, she said finally, the same phrase she'd used the day before, but with less conviction this time. Looking forward to it, Marcus replied, echoing his previous response. As Karen stalked back toward her house, Dave chuckled and shook his head. That woman has way too much time on her hands. Tell me about it, Marcus said, watching Karen disappear through her front door. I just hope the permits get approved before she figures out some new way to make my life difficult. Neither Marcus nor Dave noticed Karen immediately heading for her computer, where she began composing the first of what would become a legendary series of emails to every official, organization, and authority figure she could think of. The permit process had been exhausting, but it was nothing compared to what Karen Wellington was about to unleash upon the unsuspecting bureaucrats of their fair city. In her mind, this wasn't just about a pool anymore. This was about preserving the very fabric of civilized suburban society, and she was prepared to fight that battle with every weapon in her considerable arsenal of righteous indignation. The war was escalating, and Karen had no intention of surrendering. The sound that woke Marcus Thompson at 5:47 a.m. was not his alarm clock, nor the gentle chirping of birds, nor even the distant hum of early morning traffic. It was the unmistakable roar of diesel engines and the metallic clank of heavy equipment being unloaded from trailers, the most beautiful symphony he'd heard in 3 years. Marcus bolted upright in bed and rushed to his bedroom window, where he was greeted by a sight that filled his heart with pure, unadulterated joy. 3 massive trucks were parked in front of his house, their hazard lights blinking like Christmas morning. A compact excavator was being rolled down a ramp, while 2 men in hard hats and reflective vests consulted clipboards and pointed toward his backyard with the confident gestures of people who knew exactly how to make problems disappear. Hallelujah, Marcus whispered, pressing his face against the glass like a kid watching Santa arrive. He threw on clothes and practically sprinted outside, where he was met by a stocky man with calloused hands and the kind of deep tan that came from 30 years of outdoor work. His name tag read Tony Foreman, and his smile suggested he'd done this particular job enough times to know exactly what he was looking at. You Marcus Thompson? Tony asked, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with a construction glove filled with rocks. That's me. You have no idea how happy I am to see you guys. Tony chuckled and gestured toward the backyard. Yeah, we get that a lot with pool removals. People don't realize what a money pit these things can be until they're neck-deep in repair bills and chemical treatments. 3 years of hell, Marcus confirmed. I was starting to think I'd die of old age before getting rid of that thing. Well, you picked the right crew. We've filled in over 200 pools in the past 5 years. Your permit says standard fill and grade, with topsoil preparation for landscaping. Should have you sorted in about 4 days, weather permitting. 4 days. Marcus could barely contain his excitement. In less than a week, his personal circle of aquatic hell would be nothing but a memory. What's the process? Marcus asked, following Tony toward the backyard. First, we pump out all the water, and trust me, we've seen worse than this, Tony said, gesturing toward the green swamp that had once been a swimming pool. Then we break up the concrete with jackhammers and a small excavator. Most of the concrete gets crushed and used as base fill. Then we bring in clean dirt and grade it level. Final step is topsoil and seed if you want grass, or we can leave it ready for whatever landscaping you have planned. The methodical destruction of his pool problem was music to Marcus's ears. Let's do it. As Tony's crew began setting up equipment, Marcus became aware of another sound cutting through the morning air, the sharp staccato of high heels on pavement, moving with the urgency of someone rushing toward a 5-alarm fire. Karen Wellington appeared around the corner of his house like an avenging angel of suburban preservation, still in her bathrobe, but with her hair already perfectly styled. She clutched a digital camera in one hand and what appeared to be a measuring tape in the other, her face bearing the expression of someone who just witnessed a crime against humanity. "Excuse me," she called out in the voice she usually reserved for teenagers who dared to exist in her general vicinity. "Excuse me, what exactly is going on here?" Tommy looked up from his clipboard with the patient expression of a man who dealt with difficult neighbors before. "Morning, ma'am. We're here to remove the swimming pool. Got all the proper permits and everything." "I want to see those permits," Karen demanded, striding over with her camera already raised. Marcus stepped between Karen and Tommy, his good mood evaporating like morning dew. "Karen, what are you doing?" "I'm documenting this vandalism," she replied, snapping photos of the equipment with rapid-fire clicks. "And I want to verify that these permits are legitimate." "The permits are on file with the city," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "You can look them up yourself if you're that concerned." "I already did," Karen shot back, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. Of course she had. "And I think there are some irregularities that need to be investigated." Tony cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I don't start work without proper documentation. Everything's been approved by the city, inspected by the appropriate departments, and cleared for safety compliance." Karen turned her attention to Tony with the intensity of a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. "And what about noise ordinances? I'm sure there are specific regulations about when construction work can begin in a residential neighborhood." 7 a.m. is the earliest we can start, and it's, Tony checked his watch, 6:15. "We're just setting up equipment right now. No loud machinery until 7 on the dot." "What about dust control? Air quality impact? The effect on neighboring properties?" Marcus watched in horrified fascination as Karen peppered Tony with questions, each one more desperate than the last. It was like watching someone try to stop a tidal wave with increasingly smaller buckets. "Ma'am," Tony said with the patience of a saint, "we follow all EPA guidelines for dust suppression, and this is standard residential construction work. We're not operating a quarry here." "But the property line," Karen suddenly exclaimed, as if she just discovered the smoking gun that would shut down the entire operation. "How do I know you're not encroaching on neighboring properties? I demand a survey." She actually pulled out her measuring tape and began stretching it toward Marcus's fence, as if she planned to conduct her own property line investigation. "Karen," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm, "that's my pool, on my property, being removed by licensed contractors with city permits. You have no legal standing to interfere with this work." "I have rights as an affected neighbor," Karen declared, snapping more photos. "This construction will impact my property values, my quality of life, and the character of our neighborhood." By now, Tommy's crew had stopped their setup work and were watching the exchange with the kind of fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. One of the younger workers was actually grinning, apparently entertained by Karen's performance. "Look, lady," Tony said, his patience finally showing signs of wear. I've got a job to do and a schedule to keep. If you want to file complaints with the city, that's your business, but you can't interfere with legally permitted construction work. We'll see about that, Karen muttered, but she took a step back, apparently recognizing that Tony was not the pushover she'd hoped for. Dave Chen chose that moment to emerge from his house with a cup of coffee, taking in the scene with obvious amusement. "Morning, Marcus," he called out cheerfully. "Big day, huh?" "The best day I've had in 3 years," Marcus replied, shooting a pointed look at Karen. "Hey, Karen," Dave said with mock innocence, "I see you're up early to witness the historic destruction of suburban civilization." Karen's face flushed red. "This isn't a joke, Dave. What Marcus is doing affects all of us." "Yeah," Dave agreed, taking a sip of his coffee. "It affects us by eliminating a mosquito breeding ground and removing a health hazard. I'm devastated." Before Karen could formulate a response, Tony cleared his throat and addressed his crew. "All right, guys, it's 7 o'clock. Time to make some noise." The sound of the first jackhammer firing up was like a gunshot signaling the start of a race. Marcus felt a surge of vindication as the pneumatic tool began breaking up the concrete edge of his pool, each chunk of destroyed material representing another step toward freedom. Karen stood there for a moment, watching her last-ditch effort to stop the demolition crumble along with the pool concrete. Her camera hung forgotten in her hand as the reality of the situation finally sank in. Marcus was really doing this, the city had approved it, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop it. "This isn't over," she said for the third time in as many days, but the words lacked conviction now. The jackhammers were too loud, the progress too visible, and the futility of her position too obvious. As Karen retreated toward her house, Marcus allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction. The morning sun was climbing higher, the construction crew was making excellent progress, and for the first time in 3 years, he could envision a backyard that didn't fill him with dread every time he looked at it. "You know," Dave said, raising his coffee mug in a toast, "I think this calls for celebration. Want some coffee? I have a feeling today's going to be very entertaining." Marcus grinned, watching another chunk of pool concrete fall victim to Tony's jackhammer. "I'd love some coffee. And Dave, you're absolutely right about today being entertaining." Neither of them noticed Karen in her upstairs window, furiously typing on her laptop as she began composing what would become the first of 17 separate complaints to various city departments, the Homeowners Association, and 3 different online neighborhood forums. The battle for 42 Maple Street was entering its next phase, and Karen Wellington was far from finished. If she couldn't stop the construction through official channels, she was prepared to make Marcus's life as difficult as possible through every other avenue available to a dedicated suburban warrior. By day 2 of construction, Karen Wellington had transformed from a concerned neighbor into a one-woman opposition research team. Her dining room table looked like the command center of a military operation, covered with printed emails, city ordinances, property maps, and enough documentation to fill a small filing cabinet. She called in sick to her job at the insurance company, a strategic decision that would later prove to be career-limiting, and dedicated herself full-time to what she now considered her civic duty to save Maple Street from Marcus Thompson's reckless pool destruction. The morning began with Karen positioned at her upstairs bedroom window, armed with a pair of binoculars she borrowed from her husband's rarely used bird-watching kit, and a notebook where she meticulously recorded every detail of the construction operation. Her entries read like evidence logs from a crime scene. 7:03 a.m. Large truck blocks visibility of stop sign for 3.7 seconds. 7:15 a.m. Worker drinks beverage from unmarked container, possible alcohol. 7:22 a.m. Dust particles visible in morning sunlight, environmental violation. 7:31 a.m. Loud noise exceeds reasonable limits, measured at very loud on phone app. By 8 a.m., Karen had compiled enough violations to justify her first call of the day to the city's code enforcement office. Code enforcement, this is Rebecca speaking. Yes, this is Karen Wellington at 44 Maple Street, and I need to report multiple violations occurring at 42 Maple Street. There was a pause. Ma'am, didn't you call yesterday about the same address? This is a new complaint. I have documented evidence of noise violations, dust control failures, and potential safety hazards that require immediate investigation. Rebecca's sigh was audible through the phone. Mrs. Wellington, I looked into your previous complaints, and the construction at that address has all proper permits. The work is being performed by a licensed contractor during approved hours. But what about the dust, and the noise, and the fact that their truck blocked the stop sign for nearly 4 seconds? Ma'am, unless there's an actual safety emergency or clear code violation, there's not much we can do about legally permitted construction work. Karen's grip tightened on the phone. So you're telling me that my rights as a taxpayer and homeowner mean nothing? I'm telling you that your neighbor has the right to modify his property within the bounds of city ordinances, which he's doing. After hanging up in frustration, Karen immediately dialed the health department, the building inspector's office, and the mayor's complaint hotline. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Initial concern from the official, followed by polite dismissal once they realized this was about legally permitted pool removal. By noon, Karen had expanded her campaign beyond city officials. She posted in 3 different neighborhood Facebook groups, started a petition on change.org titled "Stop the Destruction of Maple Street's Heritage," and sent detailed emails to every member of the Homeowners Association board. Her Facebook post in Concerned Citizens of Riverside Heights garnered exactly 2 responses, one confused emoji and a comment from her elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson, asking if anyone knew where to buy decent tomatoes. The change.org petition received 1 signature, her own. The HOA emails generated 3 responses, 2 auto-replies indicating the board members were out of office, and 1 reply from board president Jim Morrison that simply read, "Karen, the pool removal is not a violation of HOA guidelines. Please stop calling my office." Undeterred by these setbacks, Karen decided to take more direct action. At 1:30 p.m., she marched across her perfectly manicured lawn, through Marcus's front yard, and directly into his backyard, where Tony's crew was breaking up the deep end of the pool. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge," she announced over the noise of the jackhammer. Tony looked up from his work, sweat beading on his forehead. "Ma'am, I already told you yesterday, we have all the proper permits." "I've been researching city ordinances," Karen said, pulling out a manila folder thick with printed documents, "and I believe you're in violation of Section 15.37 of the Municipal Construction Code." Tony wiped his hands on a rag and gestured for his crew to stop work. The sudden silence was almost deafening. "What exactly does Section 15.37 say?" he asked with the weary patience of someone who dealt with difficult neighbors before. Karen flipped through her papers with the confidence of a prosecutor presenting key evidence. "It says that any construction work that could potentially impact drainage patterns in the immediate vicinity requires additional environmental assessment." "Ma'am, we're filling a hole, not digging one. If anything, we're improving drainage by eliminating a water retention structure. But you're adding fill material that could alter water runoff patterns," Karen insisted, her voice rising. "What if it causes flooding in neighboring properties?" Tony exchanged a look with his crew that clearly communicated his growing frustration. "Lady, we're putting dirt in a hole. The same dirt that was here before someone dug the pool 20 years ago. We're not exactly reshaping the continental watershed." Before Karen could respond, Marcus appeared from his house, carrying a pitcher of iced tea for the workers. "Karen, what are you doing now?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't improve his day. "I'm protecting my property rights," Karen declared, clutching her folder of ordinances like a shield, "and I discovered that this construction may be in violation of environmental regulations." Marcus set down the pitcher and turned to face Karen with the look of a man who'd reached the absolute limit of his patience. "Karen, listen to me very carefully. This is my property. I have permits from the city. The work is being done by licensed professionals. You have no legal authority to interfere with this project. I have the right to protect my property from the consequences of your reckless decisions." "What consequences?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously calm. What specific harm is going to come to your property from me filling in a hole in my backyard? Dave Chen chose that moment to appear at the fence that separated his yard from Marcus's, holding his own glass of iced tea and wearing the expression of someone settling in to watch quality entertainment. "Hey Karen," Dave called out cheerfully. "How's the crusade going?" Karen whirled to face him. "Dave, surely you understand the precedent this sets. If Marcus can just destroy established property features, what's to stop the next owner from tearing down the gazebo? Or removing the decorative stonework? Where does it end?" "Probably with people making reasonable decisions about their own property," Dave replied. "You know, like adults do. This is not about being adult. This is about being responsible to the community." "Karen," Dave said, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a child. "Marcus is removing a health hazard that's been cited by the city. He's replacing it with landscaping that will actually improve the neighborhood. How is that irresponsible? Because he didn't consult the neighbors. He didn't consider the impact on the rest of us." Tony cleared his throat. "Excuse me, folks, but I've got a schedule to keep. Are we going to be able to continue working, or do I need to call my office about a delay?" "Please, continue working," Marcus said quickly. "There's no reason for you to be held up by this." "Actually," Karen said, stepping closer to the construction equipment, "I think there are legitimate safety concerns that need to be addressed before work continues." Tony's eyebrows shot up. Safety concerns? The dust levels, the noise impact, the potential for equipment malfunction. Karen gestured vaguely toward the excavator. "Ma'am," Tony said, his voice taking on a warning tone, "if you're trying to interfere with legally permitted construction work, that could be considered harassment or obstruction. I'd hate to have to call the police over something like this." The word police seemed to snap Karen back to reality. She looked around at the faces staring at her. Tony's crew looking annoyed, Dave grinning with amusement, Marcus glaring with barely contained fury, and Tony himself looking like a man who'd reached the end of his rope. "Fine," she said, backing away from the equipment. "But I want it on record that I've raised legitimate concerns that have been ignored." "Noted," Marcus said dryly. As Karen stalked back toward her house, Tony shook his head and gestured for his crew to resume work. The jackhammers roared back to life, drowning out whatever Karen was muttering as she retreated. "That woman has serious issues," Tony said to Marcus over the noise. "You have no idea," Marcus replied, watching Karen disappear through her back door. What Marcus didn't see was Karen immediately heading for her computer, where she began composing an email to every city council member, the mayor's office, and the local newspaper's editorial department. Her subject line read, "URGNT, reckless construction threatens neighborhood safety." What he also didn't see was Karen's husband Paul arriving home early from work, finding his wife surrounded by stacks of papers, multiple computer screens open to various government websites, and a whiteboard covered with what appeared to be a conspiracy theory diagram connecting pool removal to neighborhood property destruction. Day 3 of construction dawned gray and drizzly, which perfectly matched Karen Wellington's mood as she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the detritus of her failed campaign to stop what she now referred to in her mind as the destruction of Maple Street. Empty coffee cups formed a defensive perimeter around her laptop, which displayed 17 different browser tabs ranging from municipal ordinances to real estate law forums to a WebMD page titled Signs of Neighborhood Decline. Karen had gotten exactly 3 hours of sleep, having spent most of the night crafting increasingly desperate emails to city officials who had long since stopped responding to her messages. Her hair, usually styled with military precision, stuck out at odd angles, and she'd been wearing the same yoga pants for 2 days straight, a lapse in personal standards that would have horrified her under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. These were extraordinary times that called for extraordinary measures. The sound of Tony's crew arriving for day 3 of what Karen had begun calling the assault on suburban civilization sent a fresh wave of panic through her already frayed nervous system. She rushed to the window and watched in horror as the workers began unloading equipment with the casual efficiency of people who had no idea they were participating in the destruction of everything she held dear about neighborhood integrity. "This has to stop," Karen whispered to herself, her hands shaking as she gripped her coffee mug. "This madness has to stop." The pool was nearly gone now. What had once been a proper water feature, admittedly a problematic one, but a legitimate property amenity nonetheless, was now just a gaping hole filled with broken concrete and the dreams of what Maple Street used to represent. By tomorrow, Marcus would start filling it with dirt, and then it would be too late. The precedent would be set. The standards would be destroyed. The very concept of neighborhood stability would be nothing but a memory. Karen's phone rang, startling her out of her apocalyptic reverie. Paul's name appeared on the caller ID, and she answered with the weary tone of a general receiving battlefield reports. "What?" she snapped. "Karen, I just got a call from my mother. She said you sent her a 20-page email about Marcus's pool at 3 in the morning." Karen felt a flush of irritation. Paul's mother lived in Florida and had never even seen their neighborhood. But desperate times called for building coalition support wherever possible. "I was reaching out to family members to build awareness about property rights issues," Karen said stiffly. "Honey, you sent her architectural diagrams and property value projections. She doesn't even know who Marcus is." "The principle applies everywhere, Paul. If people don't stand up for..." "Karen, I'm coming home early today. I think we need to talk." Before Karen could respond, Paul had hung up, leaving her alone with the sound of jackhammers destroying the last vestiges of her neighborhood's dignity. That's when she saw it. Marcus had left his house and was walking toward the construction site with what appeared to be a cooler full of drinks for the workers. He was smiling, actually smiling, as he watched the systematic destruction of property values and neighborhood character. The sight of his satisfied expression as he surveyed the devastation was the final straw. Karen's vision went red around the edges. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. This was about a man who was so selfish, so reckless, so completely indifferent to the welfare of his neighbors that he would destroy a legitimate property feature and actually enjoy watching it happen. This was about someone who represented everything wrong with modern society: the complete breakdown of community standards, the erosion of property respect, the triumph of individual selfishness over collective responsibility. This was an emergency. Without fully conscious thought, Karen grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, the voice of someone trained to handle genuine crises. Karen took a deep breath and prepared to explain the situation in terms that would convey the urgency of what was happening. "Yes, I need to report a neighbor who is destroying neighborhood infrastructure and creating a public safety emergency," Karen said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Ma'am, can you be more specific? Is someone in immediate danger?" "He's systematically destroying property features that affect the entire neighborhood's stability and safety. There's heavy machinery, dust clouds, noise pollution, and complete disregard for community standards." There was a pause. "Ma'am, are you reporting a construction accident or illegal activity?" "I'm reporting reckless destruction of neighborhood infrastructure that threatens public safety and property values," Karen said, her voice rising as she struggled to make the dispatcher understand the magnitude of the situation. "Is anyone hurt, ma'am?" "Not yet, but the potential for harm is enormous. He's using heavy machinery to destroy established property features without proper consideration for the impact on surrounding homes. The dust alone could be a health hazard, and the precedent this sets for neighborhood deterioration could affect hundreds of families." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, are you saying your neighbor is doing construction work on his property?" "He's destroying a swimming pool," Karen said, as if this explained everything. "I see. And is this construction work being done with proper permits?" Karen felt a flicker of uncertainty. The permits were, technically, legitimate, but surely that wasn't the point. "The permits don't address the broader community impact," she said. "This is about more than just paperwork. This is about the systematic destruction of neighborhood character and property values." "Ma'am, the dispatcher said with the patient tone of someone who just realized what kind of call this was. If your neighbor is doing legally permitted construction work on his own property, this isn't a police emergency. But the impact on the community. Ma'am, 911 is for emergencies. If you have concerns about construction work, you should contact your local code enforcement office during business hours. I've already contacted them multiple times. Karen's voice cracked with frustration. Nobody understands the severity of what's happening here. This man is destroying established neighborhood infrastructure and creating a public safety crisis. What specific safety crisis, ma'am? The dust, the noise, the complete breakdown of community standards. If people can just destroy property features whenever they want, where does it end? What's to stop someone from tearing down historic fences, or removing established landscaping, or demolishing architectural elements that define neighborhood character? The dispatcher was quiet for a long moment. Ma'am, I'm going to send an officer to check on the situation. But I want to be clear that if this is legally permitted construction work, there's not much the police can do. Thank you, Karen said, relief flooding through her voice. Finally, someone who understands that this requires official intervention. After hanging up, Karen felt a surge of vindication. She'd escalated the situation to the appropriate authorities. Now Marcus would have to explain his reckless disregard for community welfare to a police officer. Maybe he finally understand that his actions had consequences beyond his own property line. She positioned herself at the front window to watch for the police car, mentally rehearsing the additional evidence she could provide to support her complaint. The officer would need to understand the full scope of the situation, the impact on property values, the precedent being set, the complete breakdown of neighborhood standards that Marcus's actions represented. 15 minutes later, a single patrol car pulled up in front of Marcus's house. Karen felt a thrill of anticipation as Officer Maria Rodriguez stepped out, adjusted her duty belt, and walked toward the backyard where the sounds of construction continued unabated. This was it. Justice was finally coming to Maple Street. Officer Maria Rodriguez had been patrolling the suburbs of Riverside Heights for 15 years. And in that time, she'd responded to every conceivable type of domestic disturbance, noise complaint, and neighbor dispute. She'd mediated arguments over fence lines, barking dogs, and holiday decorations. She'd investigated reports of suspicious activity that turned out to be teenagers walking while black and drug operations that were actually elderly women growing tomatoes. She thought she'd seen it all. But as she walked around the corner of 42 Maple Street and surveyed the scene in Marcus Thompson's backyard, she realized she was about to add a new category to her mental catalog of suburban drama. Woman calls 911 over legal pool removal. The destruction of neighborhood infrastructure that had been reported as a public safety emergency turned out to be three guys in hard hats using standard construction equipment to fill in what appeared to be the most disgusting swimming pool Officer Rodriguez had ever seen. Even from 20 feet away, she could smell the stagnant water and see the thick layer of algae that looked like it belonged in a swamp rather than a residential backyard. Tony looked up from his work as she approached, his expression shifting from mild concern to barely concealed amusement as he realized what kind of call this was. "Afternoon, officer," he said, setting down his tools and walking over with the confident stride of someone who had nothing to hide. "I'm Tony Ritchie, foreman for Ritchie Construction. I'm guessing someone called about our work here." "That's right," Officer Rodriguez replied, pulling out her notebook with the weary resignation of someone who knew this was going to be paperwork heavy and logic light. "I received a report about construction activity that was allegedly creating a public safety emergency." Tony's eyebrows shot up. A public safety emergency? From filling in a pool? "That's what I'm here to determine. Do you have the proper permits for this work?" "Absolutely." Tony gestured toward Marcus, who had emerged from his house with the bewildered expression of someone who just realized his backyard had become a crime scene. "Marcus, can you show the officer the permits?" Marcus hurried over with a folder containing his meticulously organized documentation. "Officer, I have no idea why anyone would call the police about this. We have every permit the city requires. all the work is being done during approved hours, and we're following all safety protocols. Officer Rodriguez examined the permits with the practiced eye of someone who reviewed thousands of such documents. Everything appeared to be in order: proper signatures, current dates, appropriate departmental stamps. The work being performed matched exactly what was authorized. The permits look legitimate, she confirmed. Can you walk me through what you're doing here? Standard pool removal, Tony explained. We pump out the water, break up the concrete, crush it for base fill, then add clean dirt and grade it for landscaping. We do about 50 of these a year. Nothing unusual or dangerous about it. Officer Rodriguez looked around the work site. She saw proper safety equipment, clearly marked utilities, and a work area that was actually cleaner and more organized than many construction sites she visited. What she didn't see was anything remotely resembling a public safety emergency. And the neighbor who called this in, she asked, what specific safety concerns did they raise? Marcus and Tony exchanged a look that conveyed volumes about their shared experience with Karen Wellington. Officer, Marcus said carefully, my neighbor Karen has been very vocal about her opposition to this project. She's called the city multiple times, filed numerous complaints, and has been documenting our work with photos and video for the past 3 days. What kind of opposition? She believes that removing my pool will somehow destroy neighborhood property values and set a dangerous precedent for future property modifications. Officer Rodriguez had to bite back a smile. In 15 years of police work, she'd learned that the phrase destroy neighborhood property values was suburban code for I've run out of rational objections, but I'm still angry. And where is this neighbor now? As if summoned by the question, Karen Wellington appeared from around the corner of Marcus's house, clutching her folder of documentation and wearing the expression of someone arriving to testify at a war crimes tribunal. Officer, thank you for responding so quickly, Karen said, breathless with urgency. I'm the one who called about this situation. Officer Rodriguez turned to face Karen and immediately recognized the signs she'd learned to watch for over the years: the wild eyes, the agitated gestures, the folder clutched like a lifeline. This was someone who convinced themselves they were fighting a righteous battle against overwhelming odds. Ma'am, you reported a public safety emergency. Can you explain what specific emergency you're referring to? This man, Karen pointed dramatically at Marcus, is systematically destroying established neighborhood infrastructure without any consideration for the impact on surrounding properties or community standards. Officer Rodriguez looked from Karen to the pool removal operation and back to Karen. Ma'am, are you referring to the pool removal? I'm referring to the reckless destruction of property features that affect the entire neighborhood's stability and welfare, Karen replied, opening her folder and pulling out what appeared to be printed screenshots of real estate websites. Mrs. Wellington, is it? Officer Rodriguez checked her notes. Are you saying that your neighbor removing his own pool from his own property constitutes a public safety emergency? It constitutes a threat to community standards and property values that could have far-reaching consequences for every family on this street, Karen said, her voice rising to the pitch she usually reserved for teenagers who walked on her grass. Officer Rodriguez felt the familiar headache that always accompanied calls involving neighbors who'd weaponized the concept of property values. Ma'am, has anyone been injured during this construction work? Not physically, but the psychological impact. Has any property been damaged besides Mr. Thompson's pool, which he's intentionally removing? The potential for damage. Are there any actual safety violations occurring at this work site? Karen paused, apparently realizing that her folder full of property value projections wasn't going to support a claim of immediate physical danger. Officer, you have to understand the bigger picture here, she said, her tone shifting to the patient voice of someone explaining complex concepts to a child. This isn't just about one pool. This is about the precedent being set. If people can just destroy established property features whenever they want, what's to stop the complete breakdown of neighborhood standards? By now, Tomy's crew had stopped working entirely, and they were watching the exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a slow-motion car crash. Dave Chen had appeared at his fence line, holding a cup of coffee and wearing a grin that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment for days. "Mrs. Wellington," Officer Rodriguez said with the patient tone she perfected for dealing with difficult citizens, "your neighbor has legal permits to modify his own property. The work is being performed by licensed contractors during approved hours using proper safety protocols. There is no crime being committed here, and no emergency requiring police intervention." Karen's face went through a remarkable color transformation, starting with confusion, progressing through indignation, and settling on a shade of red that matched her prize-winning roses. "So you're saying that my rights as a neighbor mean nothing? That I have no recourse when someone makes decisions that affect my property and my quality of life? I'm saying that if you have concerns about legally permitted construction work, you should address them through the appropriate civil channels, not through emergency services. But I've already tried the civil channels. The city won't listen. The HOA won't act. Nobody cares about the destruction of neighborhood character." Officer Rodriguez closed her notebook with the decisive snap of someone who'd heard enough. "Ma'am, 911 is for emergencies. Actual emergencies where people are in immediate danger or crimes are being committed. Calling emergency services because you disagree with your neighbor's legal construction project is not an appropriate use of police resources." The words hung in the air like a judgment from on high. Karen stood there, folder clutched to her chest, as the full implication of Officer Rodriguez's statement sank in. "Are you saying I shouldn't have called?" Karen asked in a small voice. "I'm saying that this call should never have been made," Officer Rodriguez replied firmly. "And I want to be clear that filing false emergency reports can result in charges being filed." Karen's face went pale. "False reports? I wasn't filing a false report. There really is a situation here that needs." The first post appeared on the Riverside Heights Neighborhood Watch Facebook group at 3:47 p.m., exactly 23 minutes after Officer Rodriguez's patrol car had disappeared down Maple Street. It was uploaded by Dave Chen, and it was a masterpiece of suburban social media warfare disguised as innocent community information sharing. "Well, that was interesting," Dave's post began, accompanied by a photo he'd discreetly taken of Karen arguing with the police officer while Marcus and Tony looked on in bewilderment. "Apparently, legally permitted pool removal now qualifies as a 911 emergency in our neighborhood. Just thought everyone should know in case you're planning any dangerous activities like landscaping or home improvement projects." The response was immediate and devastating. Within 15 minutes, the post had 17 comments, 42 likes, and 3 shares. By 4:30 p.m., it had been cross-posted to concerned citizens of Riverside Heights Real Estate Talk, and Suburban Drama Anonymous, a group that Karen didn't even know existed but which apparently had 2,847 members who lived for exactly this kind of content. The comments section became a digital coliseum where Karen's reputation was systematically dismantled by neighbors who had apparently been waiting years for the opportunity to share their own Karen Wellington stories. "Oh my God," wrote Jennifer Martinez from Oak Lane. "Is this the same Karen who called the city because my kids' chalk art was defacing public sidewalks?" "Yes," replied Mike Thompson, no relation to Marcus. "She reported my garage sale for not having proper commercial signage permits. For a GRAGSAL. She once called the HOA because my Christmas lights were up until January 3rd, added Susan Chen, Dave's wife. Said it was seasonal decoration violations that undermined neighborhood standards." The stories kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. Karen had apparently built quite the reputation over the years as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcement officer, but until now, her targets had suffered in isolation, unaware that they were part of a larger pattern of suburban tyranny. "This woman called code enforcement on my elderly mother for having dandelions," posted Rita Gonzalez. "My 87-year-old mother who can barely walk because her yard didn't meet Karen's standards. She reported my teenager for loitering because he was waiting for the school bus in front of her house," wrote Tom Bradley. "She tried to get my dog declared a public nuisance because he barked when the mailman came," contributed Lisa Park. By evening, The original post had been shared 127 times and had generated over 300 comments. Someone had created a meme featuring a photo of a swimming pool with the caption, "This pool poses an immediate threat to suburban civilization. Call 911 now." Another featured a picture of a garden shovel with the warning, "Dangerous construction equipment. Viewer discretion advised." The hashtag pool emergency had begun trending in local social media circles, with people posting increasingly ridiculous examples of everyday activities that Karen might consider emergency-worthy. Breaking. Local woman waters plants without proper hydration permits #pool emergency. URGNT. Neighbor caught mowing lawn during unapproved grass maintenance window #pool emergency. Emergency. Family installs mailbox without consulting neighborhood aesthetic committee #pool emergency. But the social media mockery was only the beginning. The story had legs, and it was running faster than Karen could have imagined. Margaret Foster, who worked at the dispatch center and lived 3 streets over, had recognized Karen's address when she heard Officer Rodriguez's radio report. She mentioned the incident to her husband during dinner, who mentioned it to his poker group, who mentioned it to their wives, who mentioned it to their book clubs, and by Thursday morning, the story had spread through Riverside Heights social networks like wildfire through dry grass. The tale grew in the telling, as suburban legends always do. By the 3rd retelling, Karen had supposedly demanded that Officer Rodriguez arrest Marcus for crimes against neighborhood aesthetics. By the 5th, she allegedly threatened to file a lawsuit against the city for allowing pool removal without a neighborhood referendum. By the 10th, the story had evolved into Karen barricading herself in Marcus's backyard and requiring police negotiation to remove her from the construction site. Paul Wellington, meanwhile, was discovering the full extent of his wife's newfound infamy when he stopped for coffee at the Riverside Heights Starbucks Thursday morning and overheard 2 women discussing that crazy pool lady while waiting in line. "I heard she's been harassing that poor man for weeks," one woman said. "My neighbor said she was taking pictures of the construction workers and calling them safety violations," the other replied. Can you imagine calling 911 because someone fills in their own pool? I mean, what's next? Calling the fire department because someone plants a garden. Paul ordered his coffee to go and drove straight home, where he found Karen sitting at her computer, typing furiously while surrounded by even more paperwork than before. "Karen," he said quietly, "we need to talk." "Not now, Paul. I'm composing a formal complaint to the mayor's office about the police department's failure to properly investigate legitimate community safety concerns." Paul pulled up a chair next to his wife and gently closed her laptop. "Honey, you called 911 because Marcus is filling in his pool. I called 911 because you're so upset about a neighbor's landscaping project that you convinced yourself it was a police emergency." Karen stared at her husband, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words that would make him understand the gravity of the situation. "Paul, this isn't about landscaping. This is about the systematic breakdown of community standards. If people can just..." "Karen, listen to me, really listen. You called the police because a man is putting dirt in a hole in his own backyard. With permits. During legal hours, using licensed contractors." The words hung in the air between them. For the first time in days, Karen was silent. "Do you understand how that sounds to other people?" Paul continued gently. Before Karen could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister in Phoenix. "Karen, my friend just sent me a Facebook post about someone in your neighborhood calling 911 over a pool. Please tell me that wasn't you." Then another text from her college roommate in Seattle. "Girl, you're famous. Someone in my neighborhood group shared a story about a woman calling police over pool removal. The address looks like yours." And another from her own mother. "Karen Marie Wellington, please call me immediately. Your Aunt Linda just sent me the most ridiculous story, and I really hope it's not about you." Karen stared at her phone as message after message arrived. Her carefully controlled world of neighborhood influence and social respectability was crumbling in real time, replaced by something she'd never experienced before, being the subject of public ridicule. "Oh God," she whispered, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. "Oh God, what have I done?" Meanwhile, back at 42 Maple Street, Marcus was experiencing the opposite problem. His mailbox was suddenly full of supportive notes from neighbors he'd barely spoken to before. People were stopping by to express solidarity with his pool removal project and to share their own Karen Wellington horror stories. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had actually brought him a casserole and apologized for that woman's behavior, explaining that she'd been afraid to speak up before because Karen had once threatened to report her bird feeders as wildlife attraction violations. The young couple from the corner house stopped by to ask for Tony's business card, explaining that they'd been wanting to remove their own problematic pool but had been afraid of neighborhood pushback. After seeing how you handled the Karen situation, they said, "We figured if you can survive that, pool removal must be worth it." Even the mailman had commented on the situation, telling Marcus that he'd been delivering increasingly frantic certified letters from Karen to various city departments for weeks, and he was glad to see someone finally standing up to her neighborhood terrorism. By Friday morning, the construction crew had finished the demolition phase and was beginning to fill the space with clean dirt. Marcus stood in his backyard, watching his former source of stress disappear under layers of earth that would soon support the vegetable garden he'd been dreaming about for years. Tommy walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "You know, in 20 years of doing this job, I've never seen anything quite like what happened yesterday." "Karen's unique," Marcus replied diplomatically. "That's one word for it," Tony chuckled. "But I'll tell you what, that lady did you a favor." "How do you figure?" "Well, now everyone in the neighborhood knows you're the reasonable one and she's the crazy one. That's got to make life easier going forward." Marcus looked around at his peaceful backyard, then toward Karen's house, where the curtains had been drawn tight since yesterday's humiliation. "You know what?" he said, feeling lighter than he had in months. "You're absolutely right." The community had spoken, and the verdict was unanimous. Karen Wellington had crossed a line that transformed her from annoying neighbor to neighborhood pariah. Marcus. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in what had once been the site of his aquatic nightmare, admiring a transformation that exceeded even his most optimistic dreams. Where the green swamp of despair had once festered, a thriving vegetable garden now flourished in neat, raised beds constructed from reclaimed wood. Tomato plants heavy with fruit climbed sturdy trellises. Rows of lettuce and spinach created emerald carpets between walking paths, and a small herb garden near the back door filled the air with the scent of basil, rosemary, and thyme. The October sunshine filtered through the oak trees that had once dropped leaves into stagnant pool water, now casting dappled shadows across soil that actually contributed to the beauty of his property instead of detracting from it. A small greenhouse stood where the pool equipment shed used to house broken pumps and expensive chemical supplies, and a charming wooden bench positioned among the raised beds offered the perfect spot to sit with morning coffee and appreciate the fruits of his labor. "Marcus," Dave Chen called from the fence line, where he'd been observing the garden's progress with the enthusiasm of someone who'd witnessed its entire evolution from suburban drama to horticultural triumph. "The tomatoes are looking incredible. Are those the heirloom varieties you planted?" "Cherokee purples and brandywines," Marcus confirmed, walking over with a basket full of vegetables that would have cost him $50 at the farmer's market. "Want some?" "I've got more than I can possibly eat." This had become a regular occurrence. Marcus's garden produced so abundantly that he'd become the unofficial supplier of fresh vegetables for half the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson stopped by weekly for herbs that helped her arthritis. The young family on the corner traded babysitting services for fresh salads, and even the college student who rented the basement apartment had become a regular visitor, exchanging yard work help for cooking vegetables. The transformation had been about more than just landscaping. Marcus had discovered a passion for gardening that brought him genuine joy every morning when he stepped outside to check on his plants. The pool had been a constant source of stress, expense, and embarrassment. The garden was a source of pride, productivity, and peace. "You know," Dave said, accepting a bag of tomatoes, "I never thought I'd say this, but we should probably thank Karen for how this all turned out." Both men looked toward 44 Maple Street, where the perfectly manicured lawn and precisely trimmed hedges remained as immaculate as ever. But the house itself seemed somehow diminished. The curtains that had been drawn tight during Karen's week of shame had eventually reopened, but Karen herself had become a much quieter presence in the neighborhood. The transformation in Karen Wellington had been as dramatic as the one in Marcus's backyard. Though considerably less successful, the social media humiliation and community backlash had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her behavior, but the journey towards self-awareness had been rocky and incomplete. The first step had been Paul's intervention. After days of watching his wife spiral deeper into defensive rage about being misunderstood and attacked for caring about community standards, he'd finally put his foot down with the authority of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of his tolerance for suburban insanity. "Karen," he'd said, sitting her down at their kitchen table while she was composing yet another complaint letter, "you need professional help." The marriage counseling sessions had been illuminating. Dr. Patricia Wells, a therapist who specialized in anxiety disorders and control issues, had helped Karen recognize that her obsession with neighborhood perfection was really about her deep-seated fear of chaos and change. The pool removal had triggered something primal in Karen's need to control her environment, leading her down a path of increasingly irrational behavior. "But what if everyone starts making changes I don't approve of?" Karen had asked during one particularly emotional session. "Then you'll have to learn to live in a world where other people make decisions about their own lives." Dr. Wells had replied with the gentle firmness of someone who'd seen this pattern before. The breakthrough came during their 8th session, when Karen finally admitted that her behavior had been possibly inappropriate, and that she might have overreacted to Marcus's pool removal. It wasn't exactly a full acknowledgement of her campaign of harassment, but it was progress. The apology, when it finally came, had been awkward but seemingly genuine. Marcus had been tending his pepper plants on a crisp morning in late September when he'd heard the tentative voice calling his name from the fence line. He'd looked up to see Karen standing there, looking smaller somehow than he remembered, holding what appeared to be a plate of homemade cookies. "Marcus," she'd said, her voice lacking the commanding tone that had characterized their previous interactions, I wanted to apologize for the way I behaved about your pool." Marcus had set down his watering can and walked over slowly, unsure whether this was genuine contrition or the opening move in some new campaign of neighborhood warfare. "I was wrong," Karen had continued, the words clearly difficult for her to say. "I let my concerns about property values and neighborhood standards override my respect for your rights as a homeowner. And calling the police was inappropriate." She held out the plate of cookies like a peace offering. "These are chocolate chip. I know they can't undo what I did, but I wanted you to know that I'm working on myself, with a therapist, to be a better neighbor." Marcus had accepted the cookies, more surprised than angry. The Karen standing before him bore little resemblance to the woman who'd spent 3 days documenting his construction project, like she was gathering evidence for a war crimes tribunal. "I appreciate that, Karen," he'd said carefully, "and I accept your apology. Your garden is beautiful," she added, looking over the raised beds with what appeared to be genuine admiration rather than critical assessment. "I can see why you wanted to make this change." That conversation had marked the beginning of a new cautious detente between 42 and 44 Maple Street. Karen had kept her word about becoming a better neighbor, though the change was more about absence than presence. She no longer patrolled the neighborhood looking for violations to report, no longer called city departments with frivolous complaints, and no longer positioned herself as the unofficial enforcer of suburban standards. The online harassment had eventually died down, helped by Karen's complete withdrawal from social media and her husband's patient work to rebuild relationships with neighbors she alienated over the years. The #PoolEmergency hashtag had faded into internet history, replaced by newer suburban dramas and fresher community scandals. But the real resolution came on a Saturday afternoon in early October, when Marcus decided to throw the garden party he'd been planning since the pool was first filled in. He'd sent invitations to the entire block, including one tentatively slipped under Karen's door with a handwritten note. All neighbors welcome. The party was a resounding success. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before bonded over fresh salsa made from Marcus's tomatoes. Children who'd been forbidden to play in the backyard for years ran between the garden beds, and elderly residents found comfortable spots on benches to share stories about their own gardening experiences. Date had set up a small grill and was cooking vegetables that Marcus had harvested that morning. Mrs. Patterson had brought her famous potato salad and was regaling anyone who listened with stories about Victory Gardens during World War II. The Yum family from the corner house had brought their toddler, who was fascinated by the cherry tomatoes and kept asking if he could pick the red balls. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood gathering that Marcus had envisioned when he first dreamed of transforming his backyard. The kind of community connection that a problematic pool had made impossible, but a thriving garden had facilitated naturally. As the afternoon wore on and the party reached that perfect balance of good food, comfortable conversation, and autumn sunshine, Marcus noticed a familiar figure standing hesitantly at the gate to his backyard. Karen Wellington stood there holding a covered dish, wearing a simple dress instead of her usual power-walking athleisure, her hair styled more casually than he'd ever seen it. She looked nervous, like someone who wasn't sure they'd be welcome but was determined to try. Marcus walked over to greet her, aware that several neighbors had noticed her arrival and were watching the interaction with the fascination of people witnessing a historic peace treaty. "Karen," he said warmly, "I'm glad you came." "I brought bean salad," she said, holding out the dish like she was making an offering to appease an angry god. "It's my grandmother's recipe." "That sounds perfect. Come on in." As Karen entered the garden party that was taking place where her neighborhood nemesis used to fester, she looked around with genuine appreciation for what Marcus had created. The space was beautiful, productive, and filled with the kind of community connection that she'd spent years trying to enforce through criticism and complaints, but had never actually